Good morning, everyone. I am Cheryl Buenaflor Bautista, a second year MAED student. I am going to discuss language, thought, and culture. The hypothesis that language both expresses and creates categories of thought that are shared by members of a social group, and that language is in part responsible for the attitudes and beliefs that constitute what we call culture, is a hypothesis that various disciplines have focused on in various ways. And one of these disciplines is the field of applied linguistics, which was born in the 50s. The young field of applied linguistics was first interested in the psycholinguistic processes at work in language acquisition and testing, and in the cognitive dimensions of language pedagogy. In 1980s, in the ascendancy or domination of sociology and anthropology, this created a favorable climate for applied linguistics to explore. So it started to explore the relation of language and social structure, the psychological aspects of language acquisition, and the multiple discursive aspects of language in use and in a variety of social contexts. The advances in cognitive linguistics, anthropology, and the growing importance given to culture in language education brought a renewed interest in the relation of language, thought, and culture in applied linguistics. Okay, first, let me discuss language, thought, and culture and the problem of linguistic relativity. The relation of language, thought, and culture was first expressed in the 19th century by two German philosophers, Johann Herder and Wilhelm von Humboldt, and was later picked up by anthropologists Franz Boas, Edward Sapir, and Sapir student Benjamin Lee Wirth. One of the early precursors of the relation of language, thought, and culture is Johann Herder, who lived from 1744 to 1803. He argued that a nation's language expresses the way its people thought according to the equation one language, one folk, one nation. So according to him, language is the expression of the spirit of a nation. Another early precursor is Wilhelm von Humboldt, who lived from 1762 to 1835, and he expressed the link between language and worldview. Languages contain the key to understanding worldviews of the peoples. It's according to von Humboldt. And these two German philosophers, von Humboldt and Herder, were putting in question the Cartesian claim on the universality of a human reason based on the universal human capacity for rational thought. For them, the motto "I think, therefore I am" is not applicable to all human. They argued that if human language interferes between a person's existence and her thoughts, then a person's social existence itself is inflicted by the grammar of her speech. The best known formulation on the relation of language, thought, and culture is that captured by Sapir and Wirth. It is called the linguistic relativity or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir 1962 argued that language is a guide to social reality. It powerfully conditions all our thinking about social problems and processes. Human beings do not live in the objective world alone, nor alone in the world of social activity as ordinarily understood, but are very much at the mercy of the particular language which has become the medium of expression for society. No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached. He supports the viewpoint that because of the differences in the grammatical system of languages, no two languages were similar enough to allow for perfect cross-translation. Also thought that because language represented reality differently, it followed that the speakers of different languages would perceive reality differently. According to Worf, the fact of the matter is that the real world is to a large extent unconsciously built up on language habits of the group. No languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same with different labels attached. Users of markedly different grammars are pointed by their grammars toward different types of observations and different evaluations of externally similar acts of observation and hence are not equivalent as observers but must arrive at somewhat different views of the world. This means that the language we speak relates to the way we look at reality. Worf argued that different languages represent different ways of thinking about the world around us. One example of Worf's linguistic relativity is his experience as a chemical engineer working for an insurance company as a fire inspector. So, while inspecting a chemical plant, he observed that the plant has two storage rooms for gasoline barrels, one for the full barrels and one for the empty ones. And he further noticed that no employee smoked cigarettes in the room for full barrels, but no one minded smoking in the room with empty barrels, although this was potentially much dangerous because of the highly flammable um, vapor still in the barrel. So he concluded that the use of the word empty in connection to the barrels has led the workers to unconsciously regard them as harmless, although consciously they were probably aware of the risk of explosion. Pinker 1994 ridiculed this example, claiming that this was a failing of human insight rather than of language. There are two versions of linguistic relativity. The first one is linguistic determinism, which is referred to as the strong hypothesis. It states that the language we speak determines or constrains the way we think and view the real world. And the second one is the linguistic relativity, which is the weak hypothesis, and it states that the language does not influence to some extent the way we think and view the real world. However, it does not fully determine or constrain it. Anthropologists Jane Hill and Bruce Mannheim argue that the hypothesis was never a hypothesis but an axiom that was formulated at the time against a naive and racist universalism in grammar and an equally vulgar evolutionism in anthropology and history. That's from Language and Worldview 1992, page 384. The resurgence of the concept in applied linguistics is due to a variety of developments in several related fields in the last 30 years. The first two come from the work done in the 20s and 30s by Vygotsky and Bakhtin in the Soviet Union. The other developments come from the emergence of new fields within the established disciplines of the social science. Finally, there is a growing body of research on bi and multilingualism that counteracts the monolingual bias in applied linguistics. This research is enabling us to consider the conceptual and cultural makeup of people who use more than one language in their daily lives. According to Lucy, there are three ways or levels in which language can be said to influence thought. The first one is the semiotic or cognitive level. This concerns the way any symbolic system transforms thinking into certain ways. The second one is the linguistic or structural level. This concerns the way particular languages influence thinking about reality in particular ways. And the third one is the functional or discursive level, and this concerns the way in which using language in a particular manner influences thinking. Okay, let's discuss first semiotic relativity, or how the use of a symbolic system affects thought. Let's define first what semiotics is. It is the study of signs and symbols and their use or interpretation, or it's the way we make sense of everything around us. Terence Deacon argues that whereas iconic reference or a relation of similarity is based on the negation of the distinction between signs and their objects, an indexical reference, a relation of contiguity, is based on the associative links between iconic signs and their reference in the world. Symbolic reference builds on both iconic and indexical signs and adds the unique capacity of language as a semiotic system to reflect cognitively upon itself, to refer to itself as a symbol system, and link sign to sign, word to word. Symbolic reference needs the two others, but goes beyond them, adding an interpretative response to the mere perception of icons and recognition of indexical links. What symbolic activity does is add sense, which is something in the mind, to reference, which is something in the world. That's according to Fridge 1879 and Deacon 1997, page 61. Vygotsky argues that the language the child hears and experiences on the social plane becomes internalized in the form of inner speech on the psychological plane, thus leading to both language acquisition and language socialization. The second one is linguistic relativity, or how speakers of different languages think differently when speaking. Dan Slobin and his associates investigated the grammatical level of linguistic relative hypothesis. Builds on Boa's insight that in each language, only a part of the complete concept that we have in mind is expressed, and that each language has a peculiar tendency to select this or that aspect of the mental image which is conveyed by the expression of the thought. He replaces Sapir's static nominal phrase, thought and language, to thinking for speaking, because he says that we cannot prove that language and thought are coextensive, nor that language determines our worldview. According to Slobin 1996, we can show that in order to speak at all, speakers have to attend to those dimensions of experience that are enshrined in the grammatical categories of the language they speak. Take, for example, the English sentence, "The man is sick." For a Suan would have to indicate grammatically whether the man is moving or at rest. For a Ikwakiutal would have to specify whether the man is visible or non-visible, and a Spanish would need to know whether the man is temporary or terminally ill. Slobin compares the stories told by children 3 to 11 years of age in different countries about the same sequence of 24 pictures without words. Frog, where are you? Slobin's study reveals that for all age groups, a different online organization of the flow of information and attention to the particular detail that receive linguistic expression. Example from three of the pictures. Picture 1, a boy climbs a tree to look in a hole while a dog stands next to the beehive. Picture 2, an owl flies out of the tree and knocks the boy down, and the dog is pursued by the bees. And picture 3, a deer takes the boy on his antlers and throws him into the river. English and Spanish speakers have a perfective aspect to express a punctual completed event in the past. The owl flew away. But English speakers only have a gerund to express a non-punctual durative event. The wasps were chasing him, whereas to Spanish speakers have both an imperfective aspect, the translation "the dog was being chased by the wasps," and a gerundive expression with the translation "the dog came out running" to encode the same event. Slobin calls languages like English, German, or Dutch as satellite-framed languages or S languages because motion path is given by a satellite to the verb. In English, a verb particle, while manner is bundled up with a verb. By contrast, languages like French, Spanish, or Turkish are verb-framed or V languages because motion path is indicated by the main verb in a clause. Verbs like enter, exit, cross, and manner is expressed by adding an element of phrase to the sentence. What does this tell us about how speakers think? Slobin 2000 claims that users of V languages build mental images of physical scenes with minimal focus on manner of movement, and with rather different conceptualizations of manner when it is in focus. Thus, when they hear or read stories or newspaper reports or gossip, they might end up with quite different mental representations than users of S languages. These differences are exceptionally difficult to pin down, but the considerable range of evidence examined here is at least suggestive of rather divergent world of speakers of two language types. David McNeill found clear correlations between the storytelling gestures and the linguistic structures used by speakers of various languages, thus supporting Slobin's claim that speakers of V and S languages differ in their conceptualization of motion events. Another one is Anna Wiersbicka. She explored the semantic level of linguistic relativity, and she was inspired by von Humboldt and Sapir-Whorf. She searched for a natural semantic meta-language that could explain conceptual differences among languages. She tries to identify universal semantic primitives out of which thoughts and complex concepts are constructed and in terms of which all complex concepts and culture-specific aspects of meaning in any language can be explained. For example, she compares concepts like Russian dusha, German seal, and English mind by exploring their associative networks and their connotations, and by decomposing each concept into parts whose names have simple English equivalents. So for example, the word mind in English. The word mind means one of two parts of a person. One cannot see it. Because of this part, a person think and know. The word mind or Seal in German means one of two parts of a person. One cannot see it. It is part of another world. Good beings are part of that world. Things are not part of that world. Other people can't know what these things are. These things can be good or bad. Because of this part, a person can be a good person. The word dusha, which is mind in Russia, has the following meanings. One of two parts of a person. One cannot see it. Because of this part, things can happen in a person that cannot happen in anyone else. These things are good or bad. Because of this part, a person can feel things that no one else can feel. Other people can't know that these things are, even if the person doesn't say it. A person would want someone to know what these things are. Because of this part, a person can be a good person. Because of this part, a person can feel something toward other people. She concludes that although lexical differences of this kind can be misinterpreted and exaggerated, nonetheless, they do mean something, and if carefully and cautiously interpreted, they can indeed be regarded as clues to the different cultural universes associated with different languages. In the case of English, the decline and fall of the word soul and the ascendancy of the word mind seem to provide particularly significant evidence for cultural history and prevailing modern ethno-philosophy. The third one is discourse relativity, or how speakers of different discourses across languages or in the same language have different cultural worldviews. Verbal discursive practices affect some aspects of thinking, either by modulating structural influences or by directly influencing the interpretation of the interaction context. It's according to Lucy 2000. Joel Scherzer defined discourse as the nexus, the actual and concrete expression of the language, culture, society relationship. According to him, it is discourse that creates, recreates, modifies, and fine-tunes both culture and language and their intersection. John Gompers has shown the importance of contextualization cues. He defined contextualization cues as those features of speech that relate what is said at any one time and in any one place to knowledge acquired through past experience. In order to retrieve the presuppositions participants must rely on to maintain conversational involvement and assess what is intended. Such cues may be phonological or choice of intonation, stress, and pitch. It can be paralinguistic or the gestures and facial expressions, or linguistic, choice of code, choice of lexical form, or formulaic expressions. They link what is said to what is thought and how the world is perceived by the participants. Gompers give an example of a miscommunication between a graduate student and his informant in an ethnographic survey due to the inability of the student to pick up contextualization cues. This is the situation. The graduate student has been sent to interview a black housewife in a low-income inner-city neighborhood. The contact has been made over the phone by someone in the office. The student arrives, rings the bell, and is met by the husband, who opens the door smiles, and steps towards him. The husband said, "So you're gonna check out my old lady, huh?" The interviewer replied, "Ah, no, I only came to get some information. They called from the office." The husband, dropping his smile, disappears without a word and calls his wife. The student reports that the interview that followed was stiff and quite unsatisfactory. Being black himself, he knew he had blown it by failing to recognize the significance of the husband's speech style in this particular case. Contextualization cues are part of a larger class of discourse elements called indexicals that indirectly refer to or index the personal, social, cultural, and ideological subject position of the speaker and require interpretation on the part of the participants. Hanks 1996 gives evidence of the way linguistic structures index both thought processes and social alignments in speech events. An example of this is when Hume comes to the house of the shaman Don Chabo to get a blessing. The following dialogue ensues between Hume standing outside and Don Chabo's daughter-in-law Margot standing inside her kitchen through the open window. So this is their conversation. Hume, "Is Don Chabo seated?" Then Margot replied, "Go over there, he's drinking. Go over there inside." Deictics like over there, uh, inside, and verbs with indexical value like seated and drinking refer to the social, economic, gender divisions between Margot's kitchen and her father-in-law's house, to the power relationship between shamans and their clients, and to the whole spatial and temporal organization of social life in Yucatan Mayan communities. Thus, language as communicative practice is tied to a person's position in time, space, social and historical relations, and to his or her social and emotional identity. Eleanor Ox examines what it takes to become a speaker of culture. Through language and other symbolic tools, children and adults construct the culture they live in by publicly signaling the actions they are performing, the stance they are displaying, or their evaluation of their own and others' feelings and beliefs, and the social identities they put forward, and the sequence of actions or activities in which they are engaged. Ock's work bring together insights from Deacon, Lakoff, Johnson, and Slobin by showing how language, as both a symbolic system and communicative practice, is intimately linked to spatial and temporal orientation, to the speaker's subject positioning vis-a-vis these events, and to the actions taken. By focusing on the activity rather than on the speaker's utterance as the unit of analysis, Ox is able to closely connect the linguistic, the cognitive, and the social in children's development. Next is language relativity in applied linguistics. The second language acquisition or SLA research from the perspective of language relativity. Jerome Bruner reinstated the autonomy of the thinking subject, and Noam Chomsky reinstated the autonomy of the speaking hearing subject, thus liberating the learner from behavioral conditioning and political manipulation. Both Western psychology and linguistics have adopted the rationalist Cartesian view that language reflects thought and thought is expressed through language. but also that psychological processes exist independently of language and of the social activities in which language is used. Through the 80s, second language acquisition research was not interested in language relativity. Researchers based their principle on universal grammar, and SLA research viewed the social as a stable, pre-existing fixture, existing outside the individual, not constructed by an individual's psychological and linguistic processes. SLA research focused on the standard linguistic aspect of communicative competence and the universal cognitive aspect of learning. The social and cultural turn in SLA within the last 10 years that made the language relativity principle more relevant in the field of applied linguistics. Some researchers show that it is possible to relate language to thought and culture in ways that adhere to the criteria of sound and rigorous research in social sciences, especially in cognitive linguistics and linguistic anthropology. Some of these researches are The Creativity and Play in Language Development by Cook in 2000, Ritual and Symbolic Interaction by Rampton in 2002, and Conceptual and Subjective Makeup of Multilingual Speakers and Learners by Pavlenko in 1999, and Karamsh has a forthcoming research on this. That is all about my report on language, thought, and culture. Thank you so much for listening.